Our final storyteller of the local storytelling portion of the evening moved to Cincinnati in 2002. She did a story at our True Beauty show 2 shows ago. And in our last show, one of her daughters told a story. And in our upcoming show in October, another of her daughters is telling a story. And now I'm eyeballing her son-in-law to hopefully he'll have a story to pitch for a future show too. She is the owner of Relationship Resources, which specializes in appreciative inquiry, which is a strength-based practice for organizational development. She's been running that for years. She was also the original, well, not the original, but a previous Healthy Grow director of Hamilton County. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so blessed that she found True Theater when she did, because she's got a beautiful story. Please help me welcome in Joan Hoxsey.
I'm just trying to figure out how I fit in here. 47? Somebody is 47? I have underwear over. And fireworks, we've burned down several houses in our family. So I'm trying to figure out, see how I can top your story. Part of my story is a little different, or my story in general is a little different because it's the inside story of a family that probably didn't want you to know what was going on at home. All families have a story. It's a story about who they are, what they do, where they came from, what customs and traditions they observe, and just the daily living of joys and sorrows in family life. In my case, the family story had already had several chapters written when I came on the scene on February 14, 1937. I also have underwear older than that. I was born on February 14, 1937. And when I look back over my family's life, I'm aware that the chapters that had already been written could each be given a name, probably. The chapter that was the most difficult in some ways, and the chapter that probably my family didn't want to have pulled is the chapter called When Dad Left. During the first part of the Depression, my dad abandoned the family, my mother and her 4 children, a newborn baby, Mary Therese, Jimmy, who was 1, Tommy, who was 2, and Danny, who was 6. It was a really hard 2 years for my mother and the children, especially when Mary Therese, the baby, died of spinal meningitis. And not long after that, my grandmother died, my mother's adored mother. For 2 years, my mother didn't have any idea where my dad was. And he was finally, came back to the family through a lot of circumstances that we don't need to talk about, except to say that my mother was so deeply in love with this man that she was thrilled to have him come back. He was kind of a Clark Gable look-alike, and many of you are probably too young even to know who Clark Gable was. But Dad came back to the family, and I think as I look back on that now, that he and my mother struck a kind of truce in their marriage. And that's actually how I came to be, is that the truce held for a while. My mother was a person of exquisite taste, and she loved beautiful things. She loved making a home. She was of Dutch ancestry, and all the stories about Dutch women are probably true in the sense that my mother literally would sweep the street in front of the house. She loved homemaking. On the other hand, my dad, whose mother died when he was 5 years old, really had no desire about home at all, I don't think, except that he would say, on many occasions, home is just a place to hang your hat. So the truth truce held for a while. And then in 1941, the Second World War came, and people were all impacted in terms of anxiety and fear of the war. Husbands went off to war, sons went off to war, nephews. So we all knew somebody who was in the war, and I could feel, even as a small child, that the tension in our house was rising. My dad was restless. My mother would often come and get me in what seemed to me to be the middle of the night to have me go with her, and she followed my dad. They would have an argument, and Dad would slam out of the house, and my mother would come and get me, and we would try to follow Dad. And Mother was so anxious about where he was and whether he was coming home or not. One night we actually lost him, and the next morning Dad wasn't home, and the following morning he wasn't home. And after about a week, we were pretty sure that Dad was gone again, probably for a long while. My mother got the job back, the job she had as a stenographer before she was married. And we eked a living out of her salary. I had these three brothers still. There were four of us. One day, Mother was hanging the laundry out, and we lived in a house behind the house, 121 and a half Middle Summit, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. This woman came down the walkway to our house, and she asked Mother if we had a room to rent. And Mother immediately thinking, I'm sure, well, you know, this could be some added income that was badly needed. She said, of course we do. And she moved out of the bedroom that she was in, and she and I slept in the living room. Before it was all over, Mother had rented every space in the house. She even whitewashed the basement and moved a family in there. And Dad was gone about 9 months, I think, and suddenly one day an allotment check came from the federal government. My dad was in the Azore Islands helping to build an airstrip. He was doing manual labor, which was really hard for me to get my head around because I had never seen my dad in anything but a coat and tie. And so the idea of his being a manual laborer just didn't fit with my picture of who he was. When the fact that she now had an allotment check, she had a paycheck from her work, and she had the rent from the renters, I think my mother felt the most secure financially she probably had felt in a very long time. I told you that Mother really liked beautiful things. And she had been lusting after a pair of chairs that were in a furniture store window on her way to work. Every day when she would pass that store, she'd stop and look at these chairs. And when she got a little money together after the allotment started to come, she went into the store one day. These chairs were really unusual, and they were beautiful. They were called Gainsborough chairs, and they were covered with a beautiful floral pattern. And Mother fell in love. But not only with the chairs, but with the picture that was on the wall behind where the chairs were. It was called the Madonna in the Chair. It's a beautiful, lovely picture, a copy of, I think, Raphael's painting. So my mother, of course, got no credit. But the store had layaway. And so Mother put the chairs and the picture on layaway, and every payday she'd go in and pay a few dollars until she had the chairs paid off. When they came home, the chairs came home, it was like Christmas for us anyway. I can remember many nights, she hung the Madonna on the wall in the living room as soon as she got it. And I can remember laying in bed at night and saying my prayers and looking at the Madonna and thinking, our house is as good as any of the whole number of houses on this block. After the war, my dad came home, and I think if I look back on that it was probably an attempt on my mother and Dad's part to have some sort of a reconciliation. And so they decided, after having made a trip to Oregon to visit my Uncle Del, my mother's brother, to move to Salem, Oregon. And so Mother and Dad went back to Sioux Falls, packed up their things, including the 2 chairs and the Madonna. and as we came back to Salem to look for a home. If you know anything about the Second World War, you know that housing hadn't been built in a long time, so there just were no houses after the Second World War. Certainly nothing to rent. But Mother searched diligently until she found a vacant house where the owner had been gone for over 10 years because she had been committed to the state hospital. Mother convinced the executor of the estate that we should be able to rent this house. I was about 8 at the time, and I remember being given the job of scrubbing the corners in the living room and dining room because the house was such a mess. But we had this great faith that when the chairs came and the picture came, the house would look beautiful. So the movers came and the chairs came, and we put them in this living room that had a sawdust heater. And we're so thrilled. They looked so good there. And then began to look for the picture to hang it on the wall. And it wasn't there. Mother was sure she had seen it being packed, but it was not there. And for years after that, actually, Mother and I would go into stores that we thought might have a copy of that picture and try to find one. We never did. So life went on in our family. Not too long after we moved to Oregon, my dad got sick, and he had a very serious illness that finally took him when I was 16 in 1953. He was only 53 years old. I had always been my mother's protector where my dad was concerned. And so there was this little bit of a gap, actually, and how do we behave with each other now that Daddy's gone? I found this role of being her comforter really appealing to me psychologically, I guess. And so I was always interested in what would make my mother happy. I graduated from high school in 1955, and I went off to Seattle University that was famous for having a plan where you could work an almost full-time job and go to school at the same time. So I got a job in the Bon Marché in downtown Seattle. And just across the street from the Bon was a Catholic bookstore. One day I needed a particular book for school, and so I went across the street thinking I might find it in this bookstore. I was absolutely dumbfounded when I walked into the bookstore, and here was the picture of the Madonna that we had lost so many years prior to that. And they had layaway. So I put the picture on layaway, and I paid a few dollars every payday. And when I took it home to my mom, she was just thrilled. She immediately hung it on the living room wall. And that picture stayed on every living room wall in every house that she lived in until she died at age 94. Now the Madonna lives with me. I see